Tonight, we step into fog-choked streets of Hammersmith, London, 1804, a district of soot-stained brick, gas lamps trembling in the mist, and whispers of shadows that move without bodies. In a modest parlor on an unremarkable lane, the Johnson family huddled together, unaware that terror had already slipped through their door. By morning, the house would be silent, windows staring blankly, and the walls would bear a single blood-stained message. It watches. Always. No one saw it enter. No one claimed it. And yet, within days, the alleys hummed with fearful gossip, the shadow of the Hammersmith Ghost stretching further than any street or alley could hold. The constables called it a mystery. The city called it cursed. And more than 2 centuries later, we are still haunted by the fog. The note was found pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. Its edges curl from damp and neglect, the handwriting frantic, almost illegible. It watches from the corners. Always. Tonight it claimed the Johnsons. Beware the ghost in Hammersmith. They are not dead, they are the warning. The words themselves might have been dismissed as lunacy, scribbles of some disturbed soul, except for the bloodstain smudged across the page, faintly forming a pattern like a skeletal hand reaching outward. No one knew who left it, or why. The neighbors swore they heard screams the night before. But in Hammersmith, the city's fog and soot often swallowed cries before anyone could decipher them. A man reported seeing a shadow moving across the alley, tall, distorted, and too slow, as if it bore the weight of guilt itself. The local constable laughed it off at first, claiming drunkenness, street theatrics, the usual excuses. But even he hesitated when the corpse of Mrs. Johnson was discovered face down in the parlor, the fire burning low and his wife's eyes wide open in frozen terror, a silent scream trapped in the glassy stare. It was not the first time a ghost had been blamed in Hammersmith. Stories whispered among the working-class tenements told of a figure that appeared at the peripheries, a harbinger of misfortune, a walking nightmare stitched together from urban legend and the city's unspoken sins. But now, the stories had flesh and blood, and a trail of violence. The paper fluttered in the wind that seeped through the broken window panes, carrying the faintest smell of smoke and decay. One question lingered, sticky and suffocating. What had the Johnsons seen that night? Something about that house gnawed at anyone who stepped inside. The furniture was untouched, the candles extinguished mid-drip, and yet a coldness settled over the room that no hearth could dispel. Forensic examination revealed nothing overtly supernatural. No signs of forced entry, no weapon beyond the blunt trauma to the skulls. But witnesses insisted the air had felt wrong, thick like the press of invisible hands, the silent alive, almost sentient. By the time the bodies were discovered, Hammersmith was buzzing, murmurs blending with smoke and soot, each whisper more lurid than the last. The ghost, it walks the streets. Mothers clutched children closer. Shopkeepers barred doors early. Clergymen muttered prayers beneath their breath. And somewhere in the alleyways, maybe in a hidden doorway or a long-forgotten corridor, something lingered, watching, waiting for the next note, the next scream, the next warning. The city could not decide whether to mourn, panic, or laugh itself into denial. But one thing was undeniable. The massacre had begun in the shadows, and it would not stop simply because people refused to see it. That note, pinned like a grotesque invitation, had set the stage for horror that was both human and uncomfortably something else. Hammersmith, 1804, a district wedged between the old Thames pathways and the expanding chaos of London, neither fully rural nor entirely urban. Smoke curled from chimneys like blackened fingers, and the streets were a patchwork of cobblestones, mud, and discarded refuse. Gas lamps sputtered at night, casting shadows that seemed almost alive, moving with intentions of their own. In that fog-soaked maze of alleys and tenements, life was cheap, fleeting, and often brutal, and yet people kept up the routines of living as if nothing could touch them. The city's heartbeat was uneven, thumping with the wealth of merchants on one side and the misery of the working poor on the other. Hammersmith's dockyards belched smoke, carrying smells of fish, coal, and rot. Children played near stagnant canals, their laughter mingling with rat squeals. A visitor could sense the undercurrent of fear even in broad daylight. The sense that eyes followed from shuttered windows, that whispers carried messages no one admitted to hearing. Criminality, superstition, and poverty fused into a murky stew where rumor and reality were indistinguishable. Religious fervor still gripped pockets of society, but the sermons of moral rectitude could not keep the streets clean. Gambling dens, opium dens, and informal theaters thrived alongside bakeries and tailor shops, and every inhabitant seemed to bear the tension between surviving and seeing. Newspapers, still in their infancy, occasionally hinted at strange occurrences, phantom sightings, and violent incidents. But their reports were often sensationalized, leaving the truth buried beneath half-truths, exaggeration, and public hysteria. Into this uneasy, half-lit world stepped the Johnsons, a family of modest means, respectable in appearance, but no stranger to shadows that clung to every corner of Hammersmith. Life in this district was a precarious balance. The wind could blow a fire through a row of homes in minutes. Debts could be called in by enforcers with bludgeons, and the fog could swallow someone whole without anyone noticing for days. In such an environment, fear was as tangible as the grime caked to the brick walls. Superstition was not merely entertainment. It was survival, and it was precisely in the city, breathing smoke and despair, that the legend of the Hammersmith Ghost had already taken root. Street children claimed to see it. An impossibly tall silhouette with ragged clothing flapping like wings, sometimes following the canal paths, sometimes appearing in alleyways, always silent. Merchants whispered of thefts and strange accidents occurring in its presence, attributing every misfortune to a malevolent, incorporeal hand. Even the police, weary from handling thieves and vagabonds, felt a shiver in the air when entering the Johnson household after the massacre. By situating the tragedy within this backdrop, the story of the Hammersmith Ghost became more than a single event. It was a collision of human frailty and something that felt almost conscious, something that thrived in the cracks between reason and terror. The city itself seemed complicit, wrapping its misty streets around the tale, ensuring that fear would linger long after bodies were discovered, long after the last note fluttered from its nail. The Johnsons were, on the surface, an unremarkable family. Mr. Henry Johnson, a clerk at a local shipping office, moved with the quiet efficiency of a man used to balancing ledgers and avoiding confrontation. His wife, Margaret, kept their modest home spotless and their children, 3 in total, fed, clothed, and as sheltered from Hammersmith's grit as possible. Yet behind their ordinariness, there was a fragility, an almost palpable tension that made the edges of their lives fray like worn fabric. Henry was prone to fits of sudden anxiety, pacing the floor late into the night, muttering about debts that might or might not exist. Margaret had a habit of whispering to herself in the kitchen while the children slept, as though conversing with an unseen presence that had taken up residence in the corners of their home. The children, young Thomas, 5, and the twins Eliza and Samuel, aged 8, were vibrant but quiet, the kind of children who watched the world from the safety of the hearth and rarely ventured into the streets alone. Neighbors described them as strangely serious, a tone that sounded almost eerie when spoken aloud in Hammersmith, where seriousness was often mistaken for sorrow, and sorrow for a harbinger disaster. And perhaps that is what made the family so haunting in retrospect. They were ordinary, yes, but they lived on a knife edge of something the city refused to name. Henry had, in the months leading up to the massacre, become obsessed with the stories circulating about the Hammersmith Ghost. At first, it was idle curiosity, a conversation over a pint, a shrug to make his friends laugh. But soon, he began cataloging sightings, jotting them in a ledger with meticulous care, sketching shadowy forms, and recording times, locations, and witness statements. Margaret grew uneasy. She told neighbors that Henry's obsession had a fever quality, as if he were inviting danger into their home with every note he scribbled. The Johnsons' life was a delicate balance of routine, superstition, and creeping dread. Yet there was also warmth, the laughter of children playing quietly in the parlor, the smell of fresh bread, the subtle pride of family trying to maintain normalcy in a city that seemed determined to strip it away. And it is that contrast that makes their story unbearable. The vibrancy of life crushed under the weight of something unnameable, unseen, but devastatingly real. Friends and acquaintances later recalled Henry as a man with mind too sharp for neighborhood, but too fearful for his own safety. Margaret was described as kind but haunted, aware of the world in a way that frightened even her closest allies. And the children were simply there, caught in the crossfire of adult fears in a city that thrived on whispers. It is impossible to separate the Johnsons from a myth that would consume them. They were not just victims. They were living mirrors reflecting the very terror that Hammersmith had cultivated for generations. They had stumbled into a story older than themselves, a shadow that watched, waited, and eventually decided that the ledger, the notes, and the sleepless nights were not enough. The ghost had chosen its audience, and the Johnsons were tragically, irreversibly tuned in. It began with the children, not with screams, not with shadows, but with small, almost innocuous incidents that nobody thought much of at first. Thomas came to his mother one morning, cheeks flushed, whispering about a man in the hallway who didn't have a face. Margaret laughed nervously, attributing it to a dream or the boy's vivid imagination. But when the twins joined in the next evening, describing the same figure standing silently in the corner of the parlor, unease crept like smoke through the walls. Henry, obsessed with the ghost stories, initially saw this as confirmation, an almost thrilling proof that the legends were real. He began pacing late at night, muttering to himself about patterns in the shadows, marking the corners of rooms with chalk, trying to trap whatever presence haunted them. Margaret's anxiety turned into terror. She insisted that something else had entered their home, something that no ledger, no notes could control. Their friends noticed a change in the house, a heaviness, a coldness in rooms that should have radiated warmth. Candles extinguished mid-flame, doors creaked open on their own, and the children refused to sleep in their rooms, huddling together in a single bed as though proximity could stave off the unknown. Then came the letters, handwritten notes, sometimes addressed to Henry, sometimes to no one, slipped under doors or pinned to walls. Some were crude, others eloquent, all tinged with menace. It watches. It remembers. You cannot hide. The handwriting varied, sometimes scrawled, sometimes looping and neat, but the message was singular. Panic began to seat itself in Henry's mind. He spoke of confronting the ghost, of waiting in the parlor until it revealed itself. Margaret tried to calm him, tried to insist that reason could drive away fear. But reason has little power against terror that enters through the cracks of home, whispering in the voices of children, rustling in the drapes, and settling like ice on the back of your neck. Neighbors report seeing strange lights flicker in the Johnson windows at odd hours, shadows moving without bodies, and the faint sound of sobbing echoing into the alleyways. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the family had angered the ghost. Others whispered debts unpaid or sins unknown. The local constable received anonymous warnings, urging him to leave them to their fate if he valued his own life. Yet none of these signs fully prepared the neighborhood, or anyone, for what happened that dreadful night. On the evening of the massacre, a dense fog rolled through Hammersmith, thick and suffocating. Candles flickered in the Johnson home, then died. Windows rattled with a wind that smelled faintly of smoke and iron. And then, the screams. They were brief, horrifying, impossibly human yet distorted, as if filtered through a layer of nightmare. When neighbors finally dared to enter, the family was gone, leaving only the note pinned to the wall, soaked in something unmistakably real, unmistakably final. Henry and Margaret lay sprawled across the floor, the children huddled as if in protective embrace, eyes wide, silent witnesses to something they could neither name nor survive. What makes the Hammersmith Massacre so maddening is not just the brutality, it's the contradictions. Every piece of evidence seemed to whisper a different story, none of them fitting neatly into a logical frame. The coroner's report noted blunt trauma, yet there were no weapons found. Blood spatter suggested struggle, yet the furniture remained untouched. Footprints outside were smudged, incomplete, almost as if the perpetrator, or something, had slid across the cobbles rather than walked. Witnesses described a tall shadow, shifting and elongated, vanishing around corners in ways that defied physics. The more officials examined the scene, the more it resisted explanation. Local residents offered testimonies that were disturbingly vivid and inconsistent. Mrs. Price and Elaine overswore she saw a figure carrying the children at dusk, tall, hunched, moving unnaturally fast, like a predator gliding over rooftops. Mr. Fletcher, a dock worker, insisted that the Johnsons' parlor glowed with an eerie blue light the night before the deaths. Even the postman, a man normally impervious to superstition, claimed that letters he delivered were later returned, soaked with what looked like ink and blood. Every account pulled in a different direction, a maddening kaleidoscope that only deepened fear. Rumors began to swirl into fevered speculation. Some believed the ghost itself had enacted vengeance, drawn by Henry's obsessive record-keeping. Others whisper a rival family, neighbors who envied the Johnsons' modest stability. A handful suggested something darker, a clandestine cult operating in Hammersmith's shadows, ritualistic in their intent, leaving the ghost as a cover. Newspapers picked up fragments of the story, inflating minor details into lurid headlines, calling it the Phantom Murders and hinting at supernatural involvement. The city became alive with anticipation, everyone waiting for the next sighting, the next note, the next victim. Yet the evidence refused to solidify. The constabulary found items that seemed planted, a silver locket belonging to Margaret lying in the canal, half submerged and inexplicably clean. A child's shoe appeared atop a roof, miles from home. These anomalies gave rise to the unnerving sense that someone or something was toying with investigators, orchestrating a scene designed to confuse and terrorize. The psychological pressure on the community became palpable. Families barricaded themselves at night, carrying knives and pokers, whispering prayers and curses in equal measure. Children stopped speaking of the ghost openly, eyes wide and haunted. And amidst it all, the city's shadows seemed to thicken, the fog more suffocating, as if Hammersmith itself had decided to participate in the unfolding nightmare. Every clue, every testimony, every rumor seemed to converge toward one terrifying truth. The Johnsons' deaths were not simply murder, nor merely a supernatural event. They were an enigma that mocked reason, a puzzle with pieces that refused to align. And as investigators dug deeper, the line between human malice and something otherworldly blurred until it was nearly impossible to distinguish fact from nightmare. By the time detectives arrived, Hammersmith was already gripped by hysteria. Constables moved cautiously, their boots clanging against wet cobblestones, lanterns swinging as if afraid to illuminate the truth. They cataloged the scene meticulously, every footprint, every smear, every note. Yet with each observation, the case spiraled further from reason. Nothing fit. Blood patterns contradicted eyewitness accounts. The ledger Henry kept vanished overnight, and even the pinned warning seemed to shift in tone when read by different officials, as though the paper itself carried a message that changed depending on who held it. Investigators pursued the obvious avenues first. Neighbors were interrogated. Street urchins rounded up, local thugs questioned. One theory suggested that the Johnsons had been caught in a criminal feud, perhaps a robbery gone wrong, but the lack of forced entry undermined this entirely. Another line of inquiry focused on the family's increasing paranoia. Some argued Henry's obsession with the ghost had driven him to paranoia-induced violence. But the children were found with their hands intertwined, alive in a sense, huddled, terrified, but untouched by any known weapon. The human-only theory was starting to crumble. Amid the chaos, reports of similar ghostly encounters surfaced. A shopkeeper recalled a figure emerging from an alleyway, shifting and featureless. A maid swore she felt invisible hands on her shoulders while delivering dinner. Even skeptics admitted to the oppressive sensation of being watched, to objects moving without explanation, doors opening and closing with no wind. These accounts fueled new theories. Could the ghost be a tangible entity? Was there someone or something manipulating fear itself, exploiting superstition, and the city's latent terror? Forensic investigation, primitive as it was, offered nothing conclusive. Hair samples, soot, blood, they all yielded contradictions. Henry's notes hinted at patterns, location, and times that coincided with reported sightings, yet the investigators could not prove any connection. Even the coroner admitted he felt unnerved by the precision of the injuries, the positioning of the bodies, and the eerie stillness of the children. It was almost as if someone or something orchestrated not just murder, but performance, a lesson in fear, delivered in perfect timing. Speculation branched in every possible direction. Some believed the deaths were the result of a single human actor, an almost supernatural killer exploiting folklore for cover. Others leaned toward genuine supernatural involvement, citing the impossible movements, the changing notes, and the inexplicable lights. A fringe theory suggested a local coven of occultists was using the Johnsons as a ritualistic warning, leaving behind the ghostly legend as a veil. And then, darker still, whispers floated about Hammersmith's own streets, that the city itself was complicit, feeding and amplifying terror, that its alleys fogged and decaying structures were a conduit for something ancient, hungry, and patient. The investigation thus became a tangle of contradictions. Logic versus legend, evidence versus superstition, reality versus perception. No conclusion satisfied every witness, every account, every piece of the scene. What emerged instead was a terrifying ambiguity, that the truth might be ungraspable, that horror could exist not only in action, but in suggestion, and that the Johnsons' lives and deaths were caught in a liminal space where reason faltered and fear reigned supreme. Then came the letters, dozens of them, delivered in the dead of night to magistrates, constables, even random shopkeepers. Each bore the same chilling hallmark, scrawled warnings, blood-red ink, threats that blurred the line between warning and confession. One note read, "You look but cannot see. You hear but cannot listen. We have walked where the Johnsons fell, and we will return." Officials were paralyzed. No fingerprints, no identifiable handwriting. Nothing but a mounting pile of terror in paper form. The city's already frayed nerves snapped. Witnesses began changing their stories. The shopkeeper who had swore he saw the tall, faceless figure admitted under oath that he might have imagined it, but only after a second sighting, 2 nights later, of a shadow that moved against the wind. A maid claimed it had been shoved down a staircase by something invisible and then retracted her statement entirely. Investigators realized they were chasing ghosts within ghosts, a community's fear manifesting in contradictory, self-perpetuating testimonies. Logic failed at every corner. And then, the most damning and surreal twist. A man named Arthur Claremont, a local cobbler with no known connection to the Johnsons, confessed. Or so it seemed. He claimed responsibility for the deaths, describing a meticulous plan, the exact timing, even the locations of the bodies. But when the magistrates inspected his home, nothing matched his confession. His tools, his routine, his alibi, everything pointed away. And yet, he spoke with such detail, such horrifying conviction, that some began to wonder if he truly believed he had committed the massacre, or the ghost had whispered the story to him. This breakdown extended into the judicial system. Trials began and stalled. Juries could not reconcile the evidence with the testimonies. The coroner openly admitted in court that he could not explain how the injuries occurred. Newspapers reported these legal failures with relish, dubbing the proceedings a theater of shadows. The case itself became performative, a public spectacle where reason collapsed under the weight of fear, rumor, and absurdly precise horror. Psychologically, the city teetered. Hammersmith citizens clutched knives and crucifixes alike. Children refused to sleep alone. Mothers whispered incessantly, imagining eyes watching from every corner. Henry Johnson's meticulous ledger, recovered weeks later hidden under floorboards, was a chaotic map of observations, sightings, and ominous symbols, almost as if documenting the movements of some intelligent malevolence. It became evident to everyone, officials, neighbors, even casual onlookers, that the massacre had been more than murder. It was an event that shredded the boundary between reality and myth. The turning point was clear. The city itself, along with law enforcement and reason, had collapsed under the weight of this nightmare. No clear perpetrator, no logical explanation, an audience unwilling or unable to distinguish fear from fact. Hammersmith had become a stage, and its citizens, actors trapped in a script they could not read, performed for a presence that may never have been human. In the aftermath, the Johnsons' home stood empty, boarded up, its windows staring blankly like dead eyes. Investigators concluded, officially, that the massacre was the work of an unknown assailant, possibly aided by superstition-fueled panic. But that was the closest thing to closure anyone would get. Arthur Claremont was released. No evidence tied him to the scene, though he continued to insist he had seen it and followed its instructions. The coroner issued a report acknowledging blunt trauma and the impossibility of identifying a definitive perpetrator, leaving the verdict hovering between murder and something that felt almost preordained. Despite the so-called resolution, Hammersmith did not forget. The alleys and fog-laden streets seemed to carry a collective memory, a residual energy that made locals pause at dusk, tighten their shawls, or lock doors long before night fell. Rumors persisted of figures moving against the mist, of shadowed forms near windows, and of whispered warnings in the streets. Beware the ghost. Children who had survived the immediate vicinity spoke years later of eyes that followed them from corners, of doors that opened when no one approached, of cold fingers brushing against hair in the dead of night. The terror was woven into the city's fabric. Scholars and folklore enthusiasts have since debated the massacre endlessly. Was it a human killer exploiting fear? A psychological contagion that led a family to their deaths through shared panic and obsessive paranoia? Or was there an entity, a genuine specter haunting Hammersmith, manifesting in forms that science cannot explain? The lack of concrete evidence fuels speculation, even centuries later. Diaries recovered from residents of the period hint at premonitions, warnings, and unexplainable sightings that predated the Johnson tragedy, suggesting that the ghost was not confined to one night or one family. The lingering questions gnaw at logic. How could footprints vanish mid-street? How could letters, seemingly soaked in blood, appear without a trace of delivery? Were the children really untouched? Or was that another cruel trick of perception? And what of Henry Johnson's ledger, filled with meticulous notes on every shadow, every strange sound, every sighting? Was it evidence, obsession, or a warning written in desperation? Even modern investigators, poring over historical records and forensic reconstructions, admit the case defies definitive explanation. It exists in a liminal space between horror and history, fact and folklore, psychology and the inexplicable. Hammersmith itself, with its fog, soot, and twisting alleys, remains an active participant in the story, a silent witness that refuses to disclose its secrets. Ultimately, the resolution, or lack thereof, underscores a simple but horrifying truth. Some events cannot be neatly cataloged, explained, or justified. The Johnsons' massacre remains suspended in that gray space where fear, reality, and imagination merge, leaving behind a haunting question for anyone willing to look too closely. If fear itself can orchestrate tragedy, can we ever truly know what really happened? In the months and years that followed, Hammersmith never returned to normal. Shops were shuttered earlier than usual. Children were kept inside by candlelight. Mothers whispered warnings over supper, and fathers muttered prayers under breath while locking doors. The Johnson house, left abandoned, became a locus for fear and fascination. Some claimed that lights flickered in the windows. Others that the faint sound of laughter or crying echoed through the alleys. Urban legend and lived reality intertwined so tightly that the city itself seemed to warp under its own collective memory. The psychological scars ran deep. Children in the neighborhood developed nightmares that persisted into adulthood, sometimes claiming to have seen the ghost of the Johnsons or the tall, faceless figure described in countless testimonies. Adults spoke of insomnia, paranoia, and an almost instinctive avoidance of certain streets at twilight. For years, Hammersmith was a town in miniature terror, its social fabric frayed by fear that refused to dissipate. In some households, the massacre became a moral lesson, a cautionary tale of curiosity and obsession. in others. It became proof that the supernatural could and would intrude into human life with devastating consequences. The case also left a subtle yet tangible imprint on law enforcement and legal processes. Officers learned that fear could shape testimony, alter perception, and influence the outcomes of investigations in ways that were nearly impossible to quantify. Subsequent inquiries in London took the Hammersmith incident as a cautionary tale. Evidence could mislead, witnesses could misremember, and the city's folklore could intervene as a complicating force. Legal manuals eventually included a brief reference to the Hammersmith anomaly, warning judges and magistrates that hysteria could be weaponized, whether by human cunning or something else entirely. In literature, theater, and newspaper accounts, the story took on a life of its own. The ghost became an archetype, a cautionary phantom preying on curiosity, obsession, and urban credulity. Authors use Hammersmith as shorthand for terror in a city where shadow and fog made the ordinary terrifying. Plays staged decades later often recreated the Johnson parlor with eerie fidelity, invoking the cold, heavy air and the oppressive sensation of being watched. Folklorists and historians argued endlessly over what was real, what was embellished, and what had been lost to time, but everyone agreed on one thing. The event had a weight that lingered, invisible yet undeniable. Perhaps most unsettling was how ordinary life continued despite, or alongside, the echoes of the massacre. The city adapted. Children grew up. Businesses reopened. Yet Hammersmith retained its whispering corners, its alleys thick with fog, and its stories that refused to end. The massacre was never fully solved, and in that uncertainty lay its most enduring legacy, a caution, a question, and a fear that generations could inherit without ever seeing a body, a shadow, or a single note. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is not the violence, not the notes, not the phantom footsteps in foggy streets. It is the way Hammersmith itself became complicit. The city, its alleys, its cobblestones, its soot-choked chimneys, seemed to feed the terror, amplifying fear until it became tangible, almost alive. For centuries, the Johnson story has been recounted as folklore, a supernatural parable, or cautionary tale. Yet if you walk those streets today, long past gas lamps and dockside smoke, you might feel it still, a pressure in shadows, a sense that something is watching from just out of sight, indifferent to your reason, your disbelief. There is no satisfying moral here, no neatly packaged truth. The Hammersmith Ghost, whether human, spectral, or a collective manifestation of fear, exposes something uglier than murder. The fragility of perception, the susceptibility of mind and city alike to panic, obsession, and the unknown. In the ledger Henry Johnson kept, one page remains partially preserved, a scribble, smudged by time, that reads simply, "If they can watch us, we can never sleep." It is both confession and prophecy, a chilling acknowledgement that once terror enters a home, a family, or a city, it does not leave quietly. And yet, the macabre irony persists. People continue to live, to laugh, to trade in Hammersmith. Life goes on atop the sediment of fear, like a delicate porcelain bowl perched on a cliff's edge, trembling but intact. The story of the Johnsons reminds us that horror is not always loud, that trauma can be insidious, that legends can have teeth. We cling to reason, to logic, to the idea that every event has a cause, every death a perpetrator. But what if some tragedies are designed not to be understood? The ghost may have been a man, a myth, a psychosis, or perhaps something far older, patient, and unseen. What remains undeniable is the echo it left. A city, a family, a ledger, and an emptiness that hums beneath the fog. Hammersmith teaches an unpalatable lesson. Sometimes the darkness is not at the edges of the street. It is woven into the very air you breathe, the very patterns you trust, the very walls you call home. And if you listen carefully, if you dare to walk those alleys at night, you might hear it too, the whisper of a warning, the sigh of inevitability, the ghost that refuses to be forgotten. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.